and I listened to very attentively. So to open the next discussion, I would like to call upon Professor Deeg from the Leipzig University. Thank you very much for the invitation and the ability to talk here. I studied Hebrew 20 years ago in the Hebrew University, and in the meantime, I forgot so much of my Hebrew. I forgot so much of my words, but I will try to talk in Hebrew now. However, I will tell you that it truly is something very frightening for me. I have this fear in me, and in the context of this particular context, one can obviously analyze my feeling very well. It is the fear of shame. It is the fear of the shame that might result from the fact that I stand here before all the Hebrew native speakers and speak to you with this very heavy German accent and be a reason for your ridicule, as I already see spreading on your faces, or a mix of a few other sentiments such as pity and compassion, perhaps. So please, if you do not understand me, tell me. And I can also shift or switch to English or German, which is even easier for me. But tell me if something's wrong with this. Otherwise, I shall start. Shame and Holocaust, about shame and sins and a new beginning in the Christian theology. So I will talk about Christian theology, and I do not know if you're interested in it, but you need to. You are my captive audience now. You're going to hear about Christian theology for the next 30 minutes. Actually, it is pretty rare that a Protestant Christian would talk about sentiment, so that what I said just now is pretty rare for a theologian and a Protestant Christian. With respect to this, the attention was always put on the word, on the rationale, the logic, the education and the understanding. And you can see this well if we compare the internal appearance of this Catholic church and compare it with the Protestant church. You can see that Catholics have so many emotions and the Protestants are bare of everything. We don't do this. We don't talk about emotions. This Protestant silence with respect to emotions is extremely prominent when we talk about shame. People perceive the shame as one of the most frightening feelings, as we already heard in many lectures in this conference. Shame relates to the entire soul of man and actually confronts the real self against the ideal perception of me, and in such a way it threatens to destroy my self-perception and my identity, and by that ultimately lead us to absolute isolation. Shame is a sentiment, a social sentiment, this sentiment that if we look face to face to someone else, it is a social feeling. When we look face to face to the other, it always is expressed in social relationship, etymologically speaking, so that you will learn a thing or two from my presentation. The German word Scham and the English word shame derive from the ancient German word skama, which means covering and concealing. Shame is frightening. And maybe because of this, we do not really talk a lot about it. One of the doctoral candidates did some small research for me with the Protestant hymns, a collection of 535 hymns we use for our Sunday services in our communities. When he compared the current version of this collection of hymns with the previous ones from the 1950s, he found that in the 1950s we had 11 hymns which included the word shame or ashamed in them. And maybe now, whereas in our book, the contemporary book, we only have 3. In other words, during the course of 44 years, we lost 73% of the hymns which deal with shame. Despite this fact, it is striking that there is a rediscovery of shame in our Protestant discourse in the last few years. We are becoming aware of the centrality of shame as a philosophical, psychological concept, as one of the basic emotions which shaped the Reformation some 500 years ago, and also as the first emotion that even the Bible deals with and talks about. You can read chapter 2 and 3 of the book of Genesis as a story about shame, as the fundamental story of change and its destructive force as it plays out in the human relations between humans and between man and God. But the beginning of that story is after the creation of man and the man and the woman in the Garden in Eden, and the biblical text reads, and the man and woman, Adam and Eve, were naked and they were not ashamed. And as you know, this situation has changed fundamentally as of the eating of the forbidden fruit. It was then that their eyes were opened and they discovered their nakedness and they covered themselves with clothes. Shame leads to a different interpersonal relationship, different to what they had before. Something was lost, but at the same time, it was as if something else was created. Mutual respect and interpersonal boundaries between men and women, and beyond all of that, it was the recognition of good and evil. So the nature of shame was not entirely clear. However, immediately after, we encounter the destruction power of shame, and they listened to the voice of God walking in the garden, and man and his wife hid from God. And then we hear the sad story about the inability to recognize guilt and to admit guilt. And instead of that comes the accusation of others. This sad story of the inability to say, I. And instead of that to say, no, it wasn't me, but the woman, but the serpent. This interaction between God and people in the Garden of Eden comes to an end. This face-to-face encounter when God walks in the garden in the evening breeze, but this caring relation of God to man does not come to an end. It is amazing to see that God even respects shame and actually makes skin leather coats to Adam and Eve and gives them to them as clothes. And since then, we've been living with shame. It is a part of our life. It is a part of the relationship between human beings and between man and God. Already in chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Genesis, we learned that human beings develop mechanisms to deal with shame. The clothes they make themselves or that God makes for them are symbols of these mechanisms. Without these tools, we wouldn't have been able to contend with the cruel power of shame. However, it's not exactly clear what they do. Garments are a certain tool or mechanism, but there can be other tools. Leon Wurmser researched the way people contend with shame in his book Masks of Shame, and he argues that distance from others and many other shows of human behavior can be the expression of hidden shame and can undermine social skills. When it comes to the relationship between man and God, Martin Luther, our reformator from 500 years ago, talked about the way people feared shame and the fact that they were playing chapter 3 of the book of Genesis time and time again in their lives. The chapter 3 in the book of Genesis is replayed time and time again. We're hiding, and people do not dare recognize themselves as sinners. Luther says that there are two ways in which human beings react to sin or to shame that follows it. One is haughtiness, arrogance, and pride. And the other one is that of despair and distress. Both are ways of hiding from God and hiding from other people in the population, people they interact socially with. Now, let's go back to Germany from 70 years ago. Germany in 1945, well, in 1945, the Second World War comes to an end, and the war ends, and people had to face a new situation. To many, this was a state of poverty and hardship, as I heard so much from my grandparents who told me so much about the dire situation there. For many, it was a situation in which the hopes for a glorious future for Germany were broken, and no wish replaced those hopes. And that is something that my grandmother and grandfather never told me about. I think it is fair to describe the emotion that was felt by many as shame, although this word was hardly ever used in those days. Of course, people knew in their minds and brains that what the Germans, the ordinary Germans did in the time called the Third Reich was a total and absolute moral failure. Even those, voluntary hangers in the service of Hitler felt shame when they concealed the extermination camps in Poland, in Russia, and in the East. Andreas Richter-Brunner published a sermon and called it the title of wordplay Unbekannte Schuld, namely the hidden guilt and also the unknown guilt, the guilt that nobody is acquainted with. He shows that sermons in that time tried to encourage people who experienced the difficulties and hardships after the war a lot more than to actually have any sense of remorse or reprimand themselves or explicitly look at guilt in the eye. Perhaps what was in operation here is a mechanism that attempted to uphold some pride described by Friedrich Nietzsche a few years earlier. Nietzsche wrote, "This is what I did, says my memory. I can't have done this, says my pride, and remains relentless. Finally, my memory surrenders." This inability to withstand the guilt was a very widespread phenomenon, and we have different strategies of different facets to actually deny the guilt. Some of them are extremely prevalent to this very day. A very interesting experiment of these strategies could be seen 3 weeks ago in a German publication, Der Zeit, on the 70th anniversary of the publication. One of the writers wrote a column that showed how a column looked in the publication 70 years ago. It was Harald Martenstein's column that contained sentences like the following. Under Hitler's rule, the most cruel crimes happened in Germany. There is no excuse for this, but of course you have to take into account the social circumstances, the high rate of unemployment, the poverty, and the unfathomable hardships in Germany of 1933. Or, if they handled Germany in a much fairer way, this violence would never have existed. But obviously, this should not sound like a justification, or no doubt what took place was crimes in other countries too, and I'm sure I can say it that way, but don't see this as a justification in any way, only as a hint. I fear that Martenstein is right, and I actually hear such sentences in contemporary Germany. They keep recurring. There's a difficulty here in the way we deal with shame, and there are many strategies that allow us to say something else, and I have to actually determine that these things are true for the first responses of most of the churches after the Second World War and after the Holocaust. Now, I would like to show you a few of those, first responses. Immediately after the end of the Second World War, on the 10th of May, the Christians celebrated the Ascension Day of the Messiah to the heavens. That's a bit of a strange holiday for you, but it was only 2 days after the end of the Second World War. On this occasion, the bishop of the church in Württemberg, Theophil Warn, and you can see him here, he warned against representatives of the occupation forces of the French. The heart of the German people was beating for peace, he said. The war was a war of political parties. This is why no one should blame the whole German people for the methods of violence and horror of a system which was inwardly rejected by the vast majority of the German people. In this sermon, he does not confess, not at all. He does not confess anything. He actually follows the opposite way to confession. He walks the path of chapter 3 in Genesis. The parties are to blame, not us, not we, not I. It's the system. There were only very few people who talked and preached in a different way. One of the most famous one of them was the Protestant priest Friedrich van Bullenschwing. In a sermon he gave on the 27th of May, he said, "We Christians have a part in that guilt. We do not want and we cannot try to exculpate ourselves from that guilt and the fate of our nation, nor do we try to protect ourselves by claiming that we did not know exactly what was happening behind the barbed wire of the camps in Poland and Russia. These crimes were the acts of German people, and we have to bear the consequences." It is impressive to see how he uses the first person plural. We, the Germans. This is our nation. This is our people. Hence, we are to blame. We are guilty. But his voice remained alone in these days in May of 1945. Again, we'll see that Bishop Worm's words may represent so much more of what was said by the German Christians in those days. In July 1945, he addressed a statement to the Christians abroad outside of Germany and said, We especially condemn the mass murder of German and Polish Jews. We Christians in Germany suffered a lot from these murders, and from the fact that things like this actually cast disgrace on the German name and stain the German honor and reputation. To me, it is very hard to believe what he's actually doing here. But actually, for Bishop Worm, he turns things upside down. He talks about the suffering of the Christians in Germany in view of the mass murder of Jewish life in the extermination camps. The suffering of the Christian is simply because they are ashamed and they are shamed, and their honor and reputation are affected, detrimentally affected. Actually, he places the Christians in the Third Reich as victims next to the victims of the Shoah. 5 months later, in October 1945, representatives of the Evangelical Church of Germany met in Stuttgart, and they also invited ecumenical guests from around the world, the United States, the Netherlands, France, and Switzerland. It was the first official meeting of German Christians with international representatives after the war. When they faced the other representatives, they only, needed to say one thing, and that was actually confessing the shame, the guilt of the entire German people. After lengthy discussions, the wording was formulated, and I will only bring parts of it now. I believe it is a highly interesting text. In pain and agony, we declare infinite suffering has been brought by us over many countries. We now declare in the name of the whole church what we have often testified in our congregations. The fact is that we fought for many years in the name of Jesus Christ against the spirit which articulated itself in the violent Nazi regime, but we accuse ourselves of not having confessed more bravely, of not having prayed more faithfully, of not having believed more cheerfully, and not having loved more ardently. Now a new beginning shall be made in our churches. To me, this rhetoric of this text is extremely interesting, because it is actually stating that we did so many things that were extremely good. Yes, we loved. Yes, we confessed. Yes, we did so many good things. However, perhaps these were not enough. Perhaps a bit more would have been better. One pastor said in those days, in the whole Bible, there's no comparative confession. We accuse ourselves for not loving more ardently. With this sentence, we actually say we did love ardently, but not ardently enough. This is not the way of the Bible. Actually, I think that we distinguish a problem of shame, a problem caused by shame, the sentiment of shame that emerges especially in that moment in which the eyes of the world are directed toward the German Christians. In this moment, the fear of shame does not lead to an open confession, an open and public confession, but rather to a rhetorical, strange statement of actually acquitting one from shame by way of confession. And this repeats itself nowadays again and again. I'd like to bring someone else who actually is doing something totally different. Hans Joachim Ewand, a Protestant pastor and a professor who lost his servant in 1934 because of the Nazi regime, and became a professor after the war. In an article that he wrote in 1946, he actually deals for the first time with shame, and he uses this word explicitly, and he uses a few chapters from a letter from the New Testament of Paul sends to the Ephesians in chapter 2, and it says to the Christians that were idolaters. Hence, you don't have any foreigners. He speaks away from the microphone. I cannot hear him. And the Messiah, Jesus himself, is the jewel of the crown. Before that, the letter says, the epistle to the Christians, you were without a Messiah, you were strange to the people of Israel and strange to the various promises of the covenant, lacking hope and lacking God in the world. And he is convinced that this is the reason why Christians should never, have any arrogant attitude toward the Jews. Quite the contrary. There is the house of God that has already existed, and all those who worship idols have the opportunity to live in that house of God alongside the Jews who've actually inhabited the house of God for years. But this is the beginning from which we have to look back and see what took place in the history of the church. He sees very clearly that there was a movement, a terrible movement of Christian pride and arrogance vis-a-vis the Jews. Yes, the church even was ashamed of its own Jewish brothers and sisters. It was ashamed of the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, which humiliates Jews and brought about the most cruel crimes that one can conceive of. And this is a part of the long history of anti-Jewishness, anti-Semitism. Even is convinced that after the war and after the Holocaust, we are ashamed. We are ashamed. We, the Christians, are ashamed ultimately for what we did. It is incumbent upon us to contend with the facts and with the emotion in a way that truly will change something and invite a new beginning. Otherwise, all that the church would do and say would remain empty and useless. Even calls his church to actually confess the sin and to hope that God would give the church the opportunity for a new beginning. He and others beside him were forced to work very hard before things change, truly change in the churches in Germany. And that took place in 1950 for the first time, 5 years after the end of the war. The time for confession has arrived for the first time on the 27th of April, 1950. The Council of the Evangelical Church in Germany adopted the statement or the declaration of the Jewish question or the Jewish problem. It's a bit of an anti-Semitic term, but this is where we say it clearly, that we are complicit in the crime which was committed by men and women of our own people against the Jews by our failure to render assistance and by our silence. That was the declaration given in Berlin, Walfenseen, and that declaration was the first one which said very explicitly, we believe that God's promise for his elected people, his chosen people, the people of Israel, exists after the crucifixion of Jesus. And then the unbelievable took place. A dialogue started between Jews and Christians, a dialogue that this conference 66 years later here in Bar-Ilan University is but another step, or perhaps a milestone during its course. Where are we now? I am a member of the third generation after the Holocaust, after the Shoa, the Second World War. The fourth generation is already sitting here with us in this conference. My generation, like the second generation of the Holocaust, is not guilty. I don't believe it is guilty, but in contrast to the concept of guilt, the concept of shame is not bound necessarily to what I did, but is bound to what others did. In other words, my grandparents and their generation, but also my parents and the way they dealt with the history of our nation and our family, and me and the way by which I operate or do not operate in the circumstances of our daily life today. I think that it would be fair to talk about shame, an intergenerational and collective shame as an emotional aspect of what can be called intergenerational and collective responsibility. I'm convinced that this is a very fruitful ground for the political analysis in my German context, in my political context today, which we see, and I do not know these pictures, what we're seeing in Germany now is really hard for me to see. We see the revival, the dramatic revival, and the frightening one of the radical right, and that can be examined through the lens of the discussions in this conference, through the lens of the shame and its concealment. Perhaps. But I'm reaching the conclusion of my presentation. My thesis, after this exemplary study of the first theological reactions after the Shoah, is quite simple. Shame is no doubt, especially the fear of shame, are strong motives for human behavior. Shame can be productive or destructive in its effects. The destructive way of dealing with the sense of shame leads to hiding oneself, following which the community is destroyed, and the opportunity for a new beginning is prevented. Theologically speaking, it drives people deeper into the sense of sin, meaning into the self-orientation and the social encapsulation of human beings. The constructive way leads to an open confession of guilt face to face with human beings right next to me and confessing my sin face to face with God. Shame can be a starting point of contrition, reversal, and change. This is the way new beginnings are possible. Radical new beginnings, as Psalm 51 describes in verse 12. The confessor, namely David, is using his prayer, and he uses a certain verb that talks about a pure heart that God has made for me. The next verse shows that overcoming shame and the constructive dealing with guilt and sin is related to the ability to stand before God in a different way. The prayer in Psalm 51 says, "Do not throw me from your face, from before you." Getting over shame and getting over the sense of guilt lead to the possibility to say, "Here I am," whenever God calls me. And it is also possible to change the story presented by chapter 3 in the book of Genesis. One needs not hiding before God when he walks in the garden in the evening breeze asking, "Where are you?" The opportunity was given to live beside God, with God. Every person who can say, "Here I am," when God calls him or her, is not only open to God, but also open to the people next to him or her. I am convinced that you need to have enough safety or security to actually turn shame into constructive face. the people in front of which you confess, you have to have the trust that they would not shame you, but rather give you the opportunity to tell the story of your shame, and would give you the opportunity for a new beginning, and the safety or the confidence that even God that you confess to would not shame you ultimately and use it against you, but rather take pity on you. You shall wash away my sins and purify me of my wrongdoings. Thank you very much for your attention.